All right, great. Welcome back. Good to see everybody. So as far as business goes, I have posted the latest discussion board prompt for you. It's out there on Chapter 8, Naturalized Epistemology. And the plan is for us to get into that next time. It depends in part on how much progress we make today. The hope being to get near the end of Chapter 7. I'm probably going to hold off on contextualism, which is an appendix at the end of 7, until next time. But go ahead and read Chapter 8, and I would appreciate replies before the next meeting, because it helps me to read what people are thinking as a way of structuring our time together. And as I've said before, it's not too soon to think about submitting an outline, or at least whatever you can come up with of a paper idea. A rough draft's not required, but it's highly recommended, because it gives you a chance to get some feedback from me before you submit the final version. And we've only got 6 or 7 meetings left, so the time will go fast between now and the end of the semester. So feel free to email me or make arrangements to come see me in office hours if you've got questions. So last time we were working our way through the second half, or the first half of Chapter 7 on the problem of induction, and focused in on Hume's version of it, which is sort of the classical ground zero for subsequent work on induction. So before I get us back to where we were, as a way of kind of getting back on track, somebody help us out here. What is the problem of induction, at least as Hume formulates it and as Feldman sets it out? Yeah, Ian, thanks.
He basically says that it's not rationally warranted induction at all, and it's more just like we're creatures of habit, so we form an association, but there's really no warrant for thinking that there's such thing as cause and effect. It's just we tend to associate certain things with other things, but there's really no strong connection there.
Great. Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, and as I mentioned last time, Hume's kind of notorious in the history of philosophy. I mean, notorious or famous, I guess, depending on how sympathetic you are. But for this his sort of skepticism in general about a lot of different philosophical matters, it extends to the nature of a substantive human self, to cause and effect, to induction, to his empiricism's pretty thoroughgoing. So even the a priori becomes a kind of linguistic thing, if at all. So it's not surprising that Hume would be critical of the idea of inductive reasoning. And recall how it works, right? The idea is that we notice certain regularities, and based on those we come to believe that certain unobserved cases, heretofore unobserved instances, will be like their predecessors. And Hume sets out this argument. So I'll put that back up here for you. Here's a reconstruction of the argument. This is Feldman's version, just to kind of get us back on track. And recall how it works, right? The idea is that, well, if inductive reasoning is to be justified, rational for us to make use of, then we've got to be able to provide an argument for it, some sort of basis for it. And according to this way of thinking, it would either have to be something that can be shown demonstrably. In other words, it's the sort of thing that's a necessary truth. We could establish it based on some premises leading to a conclusion, say a deductive argument. Or it would have to be done by what Hume calls a moral argument, which, again, not to be confusing, isn't really moral reasoning. It doesn't have to do with right or wrong, but it's cogent reasoning. It's inductive reasoning itself. And so when you run through the argument, we end up with, well, if PF can be justified, then it's either going to have to be demonstrably or morally. Only necessary truths can be done, can be shown via demonstrative arguments, and PF's not a necessary truth. Notice what PF is again, right? It's this idea that the future will resemble the past, and we're sticking with this past to future way of thinking about things, even though it's important to bear in mind that it's about going from observed cases to unobserved cases. That's really the core of inductive reasoning. So that gets us to the first intermediate conclusion, and all moral arguments assume the truth of a PF. Any argument that would do that is an argument that's circular, so it can't be a moral argument, and we get to the final conclusion here that past or future reasoning, i.e. the heart and soul of inductive reasoning, can't be justified rationally, which is, again, a threatening conclusion to the standard view, which is that we know a lot of things, and among the things we know are inductive conclusions that we arrive at via probabilistic reasoning. So you notice certain regularities that have held up in your experience, and based on those, we draw conclusions that it'll continue to be that way. Feldman points out rightly that that's not always the case, that the uniformity of nature or any other similar sort of principle can run up against counterexamples. That's the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. The person who's 49 and reasons that the next birthday is one where they won't be 50 turns out to be wrong. But for the most part, unless we've got defeating evidence, it's part of the standard view that we know quite a bit and that induction plays a role in that. And it's also important to the defense of modest foundationalism, which is sort of, again, kind of the default theory of justification that we've been working with. So last time we looked at the first two attempted defenses, the inductive defense and the pragmatic defense. Before I won't show it, but just by way of review, anybody want to remind us how's the inductive defense supposed to work? What was the idea there, and what's the main objection to it or difficulty that approach faces? Thank you. Everybody's asleep today. I know it's going to be a long weekend, and we're going to get you on your way shortly, but we've got to get through induction first. Yes?
So the induction argument says that, well, induction has worked for us in the past, so why not? It's going to work in the future. That's what it says. It just says PF has been true in the past, so it's going to be true in the future.
Yeah, and that seems, as a premise, that seems right. It's not clearly explicitly assuming the past to future principle. It just points out that PF's worked in the past, conclusion, PF will work in the future. But what's the problem with that? It's pretty clear when you start to think about it. Yeah, how so? Yeah, there's a premise that's, we have to add, so that's initial statement of the argument, the crude version of the argument, even though the premise doesn't explicitly have PF as an assumption, in order to make the argument either valid or cogent, we'd have to add a premise, which presumably would be PF, and that would get us the conclusion, but then we would be explicitly assuming what we're supposed to be showing. So it looks like the inductive defense, not surprisingly, would sort of impugn itself. What about the next approach, the pragmatic defense of induction? What was the basic idea there? The label helps a little bit, right? So if there's going to be a pragmatic attempt to justify this, it's going to be based on what? Yeah.
It's the one that it assumes that there is some sort of process by which we can have knowledge about unobserved things.
Right.
From observed things. So, and if such a process exists, then it's going to be induction.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Appreciate it. Yeah. So, if there is some way of coming to have knowledge of unobserved cases, then induction is the one that'll work, if anything will. But of course, it doesn't follow that there's a way to come to know reliably about unobserved cases. As Feldman points out, it might be that induction is just the least worst. So there's a bunch of different ways, and none of them are very good. And induction's the least worst case. And moreover, the kind of considerations that support the pragmatic defense have to do with success, maybe not so much in terms of our epistemic justification, but our practical justification, reasons for thinking that something will work or be successful, could come apart and be different from epistemic reasons. So that gets us to the last defense that we want to think a little bit about, which is the so-called a priori defense. Actually, before I get to that, I can leave this up here. But there is this interesting discussion, if you've got the book, over on 139, where, and this is at the end of the whole section on the a priori here, coming up about Madame Malarkey. I think some of the stuff he says in that section could be an interesting paper topic for somebody who wants to take it up, because you might find yourself disagreeing with Feldman. But here's the last idea, at least, of the a priori defense. So consider the principle we're interested in the future will be like the past. And what Feldman does is he says, well, look, that's the core of the inductive principle, but Russell, people may be familiar with Bertrand Russell, famous 20th century philosopher. In his book, Problems of Philosophy, he discusses induction, and he sort of shifts the stream a little bit and changes the principle and makes it PFR, this past to future reasoning, rather than just past to future principle. And that's an important shift. Feldman considers this as a third possible way of defending the propriety of inductive reasoning. And the idea is that although PF might not be something that's a necessary truth, PFR, according to this way of thinking about things, is plausibly a necessary truth about what counts as good reasoning. So the principle in question here is that knowing that things have been a certain way in the past gives you a good reason to believe that they'll be that way in the future. What do people think about this idea? What makes it a priori? That's one question. That's kind of a hard question. So what we would do is basically rerun the argument. Instead of making it about PF, we put PFR in there all the way through. And then there's going to be a premise that we can reject. Does this avoid or does this answer the problem of induction? Because it would really be nice to have a response to the original problem rather than changing the topic. And it sort of felt to me like kind of changed the topic a little bit. So that's a fair critical point that one could make about this alleged sort of response to the problem. That said, I think there's something interesting here for us and hard to think about, and some of it involves figuring out what to think about the a priori and also whether or not PFR is more of a dodge than a real direct way of addressing the problem. What do folks think? If it turns out that the rational acceptability of inductive reasoning depends more on something like PFR, and then we can sort of give a defense of that, and then maybe there's a response. What did people think about this section? Or did people get this section? Some folks might have found it confusing.
It seems like it would depend on the certain type of things that you knew before. PFR.
Yeah.
Knowing that things have been a certain way in the past.
Right. So you take it and apply it to the sun will rise tomorrow sort of claim. So you know that every day in the past, including today, has been one where you woke up and there was the sun. So the fact that you have that backlog of experience and you know those things, those facts about the past, those regularities, it's your knowledge of those regularities rather than just those regularities themselves. And this is kind of a subtlety. This is why I think it's worth spending a minute on it, and it might have been confusing for people. Again, the writing style is such that it's easy to kind of read through kind of smoothly and quickly. It's It's not breezy, but it just reads that way. And so it's easy to kind of get through it and think, yeah, I got it. And then as you start to think about it a little bit more, maybe not. So the important distinction here is we're talking about your knowledge of regularities rather than the regularities themselves being the stable feature. And that's why I said it might seem to some people upon reflection like it's more of a dodge, kind of changing the subject. And I think Feldman's fair in it kind of admitting that, well, this isn't, this is Russell's sort of take on the problem, streamlined, cleaned up a little bit. But maybe there's a good idea here, because the choices at this point don't look really great. If it turns out that the inductive defense and the pragmatic defense, neither of those is acceptable, which they seem to be problematic, then we need to say something. We need to have some way of responding to this argument, Hume's original worry. Otherwise, we're stuck with living with a kind of skeptical conclusion about inductive reasoning. So we can run through the argument. I mean, first of all, let's just see if people are getting it. Do people see the difference between PF and PFR? Whether you think it's legitimate or not, people hopefully can see what's going on here, that there's a shift. And so if you rerun the whole argument, if PFR can be justified at all, then it can be justified either by a demonstrative argument or a moral argument. Only necessary truths can be justified by these demonstrative arguments. PFR is not a necessary truth, so it can't be. And then the second half of the argument by cases would apply. So we'd get the same version of the argument. If this is what we really need to be focused on rather than the original version, then I think there's something we can say. Which premise is going to be the bad premise in the revised version of the argument? Because we've got to get rid of one. We've got a valid argument. We've got a conclusion that hopefully you're inclined to think is false because you subscribe to induction. So if you're going to rationally reject the conclusion, you've got to rationally reject at least one premise. So one of these has got to go. But the good news is that now we're in a position to find a problem with the argument. Yeah, Anthony.
I guess you'd have to find a way to show that PFR is a necessary truth.
Right. Yeah, so we're going to say, I mean, that's the strategy, is to reject 3 and say that, well, even if PF isn't a necessary truth, PFR is plausibly a necessary truth. It's knowable a priori. And so then if it turns out that the problem of induction is really better thought of as the problem of defending PFR rather than PF, then we've got a kind of response to the initial worry. Question is whether or not PFR is a priori knowable. Is this just part of what's meant by included in the concept of good reasoning, that knowing that things have been a certain way in the past gives you good reason for thinking that they'll be that way in the future, assuming you don't have defeating evidence to the contrary. So if you look at, what do people think? I mean, he says some different things over on 138. He has a kind of section here in the center of that page. Quite plausibly, the definition or nature of the concept of being reasonable makes it true. There is no possible situation in which the antecedent could be true, yet you would not be reasonable in believing that the selected marble is black. This is from the example above. M2 is something we can know to be true a priori. That is, we can know it simply by understanding the concepts involved. We don't have to observe cases and infer its truth. If you're worried about that, or you're not quite buying that, then you might want to make something like this part of your paper. You might want to take this up in your paper. And the other part you could add to this is over on 139. There's this discussion of the tea leaves that comes on the heels of the a priori defense. And so here's the worry: is that maybe this seems too good to be true? Does it seem like we're taking it easy on the problem or dodging the problem here. And Feldman acknowledges this. He says critics may think that this solution to Hume's problem, just advanced, is no better than merely stipulating that induction is reasonable. So we get this example, 7.1, Madame Malarkey, the tea leaf reader. Anybody want to read that one for us? And see how that, if we can do better than, if this approach is any better than the tea leaf example would have it be. Yeah, Ian, thank you.
Madame Malarkey uses the configuration of the tea leaves to form beliefs about unseen objects. She wants to know something about some object. Madame Malarkey will read the tea leaves and by means of some secret formula use what she sees in them to form a belief about the unseen object. Critics object that her methods are irrational nonsense. Some attempt to challenge her, asking if she has found that her beliefs have proved to be correct. She replies, of course, that to worry about track records and past performance is the sheer prejudice of irrational inductivists. The tea leaves tell her that the tea leaves are the way to proceed, and, when further challenged, she offers an a priori defense of her approach. She says that there is a principle that is true by definition. TLR. Knowing that the tea leaves predict that P will be true provides good reason to believe that P will be true.
Great, thanks, I appreciate it. Yeah, so everybody got the setup, the Madame Malarkey sort of purported counterexample or rebuttal to thinking that PFR is a priori knowable. So we get a kind of parallel principle here, right? So you get TLR and PFR, and TLR is the one that should seem kind of bogus. And Feldman has three different things to say back in response to this sort of rebuttal. You might consider a paper where you look at those three responses and say what you think about them, whether they're adequate or not. Are they any good? He talks, so one of the first things that he says is that maybe we can't offer a proof or show that PFR is true, but that doesn't mean that it isn't true, and that doesn't mean that our total evidence on balance doesn't support it. The second thing he says is this stuff about, and he's mentioned this before, distinguishing different projects. So one project is trying to convince intransigent skeptics, people who are sort of dogmatically skeptical. And that's not really, that shouldn't really be our project. And he says that maybe even Hume would find some merit in the response. I don't know. The third one, though, I think is the core response to the tea leaf case. And then it involves this idea, this distinction between fundamental principles and derivative principles. And this comes up again a little bit later when he's talking about immediate perceptual justification. He cites Roderick Chisholm, another influential 20th century epistemologist who spent his lifetime trying to formulate various epistemic principles. And this distinction is kind of interesting. What Feldman seems to want to suggest there is that the tea leaf principle isn't a fundamental principle, but the past to future reasoning principle is fundamental, and because it's fundamental, it's okay. So that would be something, if you wanted to explore it as part of a paper dealing with this section, I think that would be interesting. You might not agree, or you might think that this distinction can't be made out, or what is it about the one that makes it legitimate and the other not. So I think all of these would be fair things to consider, to think about. So let me just pause for a second, see if people have thoughts, questions about. So of the three responses, clearly this is Feldman's preferred way of going. But as I say, he kind of shifts streams a little bit here on us. Instead of talking about defending PF, we're really defending PFR. So sort of a different thing. Thoughts, questions, comments, confusions on this much? Well, Ian, you look like you were starting to say something. No? Okay. So, this may be frustrating for some folks. I'll mention, before we get to the next section here, that because the stuff on induction is kind of hard, I grant that, There's another problem that's associated with Nelson Goodman, and it's called the problem of GRU. It's kind of a weird word, GRU. This is Nelson Goodman's problem. And this comes up, this is sometimes called the new riddle of induction. This would also be fair if somebody wanted to look into that. If you're interested in thinking about Goodman's problem in GRU, let me know. I can send you a paper or two to kind of get you started. There's been a ton of literature written about it. So the idea was Goodman is a mid-20th century philosopher of science and worked in a variety of different areas. But Goodman says, consider the statement that all emeralds are green. Seems right. And based on past experience, we've observed lots of emeralds. They've all turned out to be green in color. And if something like PF or PFR is true, then we can make the inference to the claim that all emeralds are green, not just all observed up to this point, but that all of them, past, present, and future, heretofore unobserved emeralds are green. He says, now consider a different predicate. Instead of green, which expresses property, right, being a certain color, consider the predicate GRU, which he defines as something is GRU if it's been observed up to this point and has been green, or it's observed after this point and it's blue. So it turns out that all the evidence that we've got right now for thinking that all emeralds are green is the exact same evidence that we've got for thinking that all emeralds are GRU, but we're justified, the intuition is we're justified in believing that they're all green, but we're not justified in believing that they're all GRU, because GRU is just a made-up predicate. So he takes green and blue and he comes up with GRU and bleen, and he sets up this kind of problem. And part of the puzzle there is part of what he's interested in is trying to figure out what makes certain predicates projectable or certain properties projectable into, he calls it projectability, stable into the future so that our inferences can work on them. And his solution, again, this is more a reflection, I think, of Goodman's own philosophical dispositions, is that certain predicates are just entrenched. You'd like to be able to, in our practice, which again is kind of less than what I think a more thoroughgoing kind of realism would really want, what we'd like is to think that, well, there's more to it than that. I mean, these are green and blue are real stable properties that express that we can, in fact, perform these and make these inductive inferences based on reliably, but GRU and bleen aren't like that. They're these kind of gerrymandered Cambridge-type properties that involve things changing their colors over time, and that's not those kinds of predicates don't carve the world at its joints. They're just constructed. Goodman doesn't seem to take that as the moral of his problem. So if you're interested in thinking about the problem of GRU, I think that'd be another fair topic. All right. So next up, in the second half of Chapter 7, we start thinking about ordinary standard skepticism from a slightly different perspective. So, what is ordinary standard skepticism? We've talked about the problem of induction and how that can be leveraged by skeptics in order to make a case against the standard view, since a lot of our knowledge and putative knowledge is arrived at inductively. But even if you're not impressed by these inductive worries, skeptical worries about induction, or you're not sold on high standard skepticism, you might still worry that, hey, there's a real threat out there. It's ordinary standard skepticism. How does that work? Well, the ordinary standard skeptic is one who makes the following claim: the view that we lack knowledge because we fail to satisfy the ordinary standards that are in force. This is all starting over on page 141. And so we begin with this claim, O, has to do with one's current observations and evidence. I have memory and perceptual experiences that are regular and orderly. And the common sense explanation, presumably the one we all accept unless you're now going skeptical, which is on the table, is that there's a world of enduring and relatively stable middle-sized physical objects, etc. The tables, the chairs in this room, the room itself, each of us. My experiences are typically caused by these objects stimulating my sense organs. So this is what we've got to work with. This is our sort of observable, observational claim. And the best explanation, or at least the common sense explanation, we'll see whether it counts as best or not, is CS here. But we also recognize, because we've been thinking about skepticism for a while, that there are a number of competing alternative skeptical hypotheses. Among them are the brain in a vat hypothesis, namely that I'm a brain in a vat connected to a very powerful computer. The computer stimulates my brain, gives me the sense experiences that I'm having. The computer's been programmed to make these experiences seamless, orderly, regular, on the same par with something like the Matrix. So, that would do as well. The dream hypothesis, another one, all of my experiences are dreamed experiences. My dreams are usually relatively systematic and orderly. Of course, that second assumption wouldn't be, I think, consistent with most of our dreamed experiences, but we can't rule it out. It just seems like a technical hurdle. It's not a lot. There's no logical barrier to dreamed experiences being orderly and regular in the relevant sense. The evil genius hypothesis, we thought about that with Descartes at the end of Meditation 1. My experiences are caused by an evil scientist or genius. The genius causes me to have regular, orderly experiences in order to trick me. And on and on and on. So there are all these different competing skeptical alternatives. And that gives rise to the following argument for ordinary standard skepticism. And I think in a lot of ways maybe this is after you kind of take the wind out of the sails of high standard skepticism. If you buy into the response that we've been considering there, namely that fallibilism is a way of avoiding having to have absolute certainty, conclusive reasons, conclusive evidence, and that at least the four high standard skeptical arguments that we talked about all presuppose that we have to satisfy the very high standard. We have to have conclusive reasons or evidence, but if we don't, then we've got a way out. We can reject those conclusions, so no problem there. Induction, similarly, if you think that something like Feldman's last approach that he considers there, the sort of past to future reasoning principle, is an a priori principle, and it's part of what we mean by good reasoning, that knowing about past cases provides a reason for thinking future cases will be that way, and as long as there's no defeating evidence, then what we're left with is this final kind of skepticism, which I think in some ways maybe is the most threatening and worrisome, even though I think the high standard skepticism is a lot of fun to think about. So we end up with this argument. So here's the skeptical argument for us to consider. The alternative hypotheses argument. The evidence that people have, which is O up at the top, does not provide better reason to believe ordinary external world propositions and the common sense hypothesis than to believe these rival skeptical hypotheses like the dreamed one, the BIV, the evil genius. Second premise here in the argument. If one's evidence doesn't provide a better reason to believe one hypothesis than to believe some rival hypothesis, then one is not justified in believing that hypothesis. So we were able to get the conclusion that we're not justified in believing and thus don't know ordinary external world claims to be true. So simple argument, two premises and a conclusion. There's not a whole lot there to get lost in, but there's a lot to think about. So before I go any further and we think about the three sort of ways that Feldman considers of responding to this argument, I'd much rather hear what you guys think. Anthony.
So I'm not, could we be justified in not believing in VIVDR, e.g. on the basis of there being a simpler explanation?
So that's one of the things we're going to consider. Yes, there'll be three responses. Three seems to be the number people like, or at least that he likes, when we consider ways of dealing with these arguments. So, but go ahead and say more about what you were thinking, because it's probably in line with. So is your thought that the reason why we're justified in the common sense hypothesis as the best explanation of our overall experience right now is that it's the simplest one? Okay, and the other ones are needlessly complex, right? But in some ways, I mean, we'll get to this because that's one of the last things that's the last one he considers. I mean, isn't the matrix hypothesis pretty simple, and the dream hypothesis is pretty simple, and the brain in the vat? I mean, the matrix is pretty simple when you think about it. We're all in the matrix right now. What's so hard about that? It's kind of like conspiracy theories. I mean, some of them, part of what I'm getting at here is it's just rhetorical, of course, but is trying to say what it is about one theory that makes it simpler than another is a big part of the problem. And there's been quite a bit written on this, mostly in the philosophy of science. But this idea that, well, all things being equal, prefer the simpler of two theories, which people remember. Anybody remember what that's called? Occam's razor, yeah. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. So in a situation where you have a number of different theoretical alternatives, all trying to predict and explain, or account for the same phenomena, if they're truly on a par, then you should prefer, as a theoretical consideration, you go with the simplest explanation. It's the most likely to be true. There's no guarantee, but I think to just say, well, this is the common sense one's the simplest, and all these things are, needlessly complex, may need to say a little bit more than that. In part, just to bear down on what are the relevant aspects of a theory that make for simplicity, because in some ways, the evil genius, the matrix, seem to me to be kind of simple theories. You wouldn't have to. If we're all in the matrix, if we're all brains in vats, if we're all the hapless victims of the evil genius, then the theory is really simple in the sense that you don't have to have all the stuff literally out there in the external world that the common sense hypothesis and that science tells us is out there. You don't get all the particles, right? You don't get tables and chairs. You don't get maybe lots of different people. Things get simpler in a lot of respects. I mean, if some version of solipsism is true, and you're a brain in a vat, that seems like a pretty simple theory. I mean, why not? What's simpler about when you think about it, the scientific explanation's the complicated explanation, because science is never simple. That's part of what makes it fascinating and frustrating at the same time is scientific theories are constantly being subjected to evaluation and revision, and we find out that we're wrong about the details, and so we have to either modify the theory or jettison it altogether. And if you think about it, there's not much that's really simple about physics and chemistry and biology, and physical chemistry and biochemistry and genetics. All of these are really complicated areas of inquiry that involve lots and lots of different moving parts. So while I'm inclined, as an anti-skeptic myself, I've already kind of laid my cards out on the table, while I'm inclined to think that something like what you're saying and that we'll consider at the very end is promising, I don't want to go too easy on our view here. on the standard view. I want to be able to take the skeptic's challenge seriously. And if it is in virtue of theoretical simplicity that we're more justified in believing the common sense hypothesis and ruling out these skeptical ones, then it'd be really nice to have a story to tell about what makes for theoretical simplicity, given that science is not real simple. And anybody who's ever taken some science courses, all of you have had to, you know that. So in some ways, the idea that everything's being caused by an evil genius who's super powerful, almost as powerful as God, the way Descartes sets it up at the end of Meditation 1, pretty simple story. The Matrix, again, so you have to tell the story the right way. We'd have to ask, there'd be questions about exactly how the Matrix works and how complicated is it, but presumably it could be made fairly simple. Dreaming, again, if everything's always been a dream, sort of like Inception, where it's just a dream within a dream within a dream, that's all that's going on. Fairly simple sort of idea. So I'm playing devil's advocate partly here to provoke people into thinking about this and not going too easy on our own view. Thoughts? And if you're interested in trying to respond to this challenge, then make that the topic of your paper. There's lots and lots of literature on simplicity, theoretical simplicity, Occam's razor, best explanations. I can give you a reference to a paper or two that I think are really good on this topic. I'll come back around here in just a second to thinking about this at the very end. I just kind of want to go in order. So let me put up the first response. So Feldman considers 3 at the end of the chapter here to this idea of ordinary standard skepticism, which, as I say, I think this is the most challenging at the end of the day. I mean, setting aside induction only because that's such a special topic. If you want to think about that, then that's going to take us into inductive logic and things will get complicated. But outside of high standard skepticism, sort of full-blown Cartesian-style skepticism, I think this is really where the hard work has to be done. And there's been less written about this as well, so there's some breathing room here if somebody wanted to try to take this on. So Feldman considers 3 different possible responses: epistemological conservatism, immediate perceptual justification, and inference to the best explanation, which is where the discussion of theoretical simplicity comes in. So the first of these ideas, epistemological conservatism. What's the idea behind this? Well, anybody want to try to say? Anybody remember it? It's interesting. A buddy of mine did his dissertation on this when we were in grad school together. And I remember sitting there and reading some of his stuff. So here's the basic idea. That it's the view that a person is justified in retaining an existing belief unless the person's evidence is better supported by a rival belief. And so in the discussion, if you recall in this section of the chapter, he gives some different examples. So suppose you're driving a car right now, and the question of whether or not to get a different car comes up. There are different reasons why you might want to get a new car. Presumably, whatever the motivation is would have to involve considerations that would make you on balance better off. You wouldn't go to the trouble to, especially if you've done this any time recently, you know that it's not fun having to get the title changed over and get the tags and registration and spend a bunch of different days at the DMV, that fun place. Okay? So if you can avoid all of that, you're not going to go to the trouble to get rid of a perfectly good car for another car that's no better off by some set of criteria that you value. To just swap cars needlessly would make no sense. You're better off just sticking with the one you've got. If this sounds a little bit like if it ain't broke, don't fix it for epistemology, then it kind of is in a way. And what makes the view conservative is this notion of hanging on to existing beliefs if there's no real pressure to give them up. So the idea applied to the worry we've got is we suppose you already believe the common sense hypothesis, which presumably you do, that the best explanation of O, that you're having certain observations and certain apparent memories and perceptual experiences as of being in a room with other people, the best explanation of all of that data is that there really is a room, and there really are the other people, and you're in it with them, tables and chairs and the whole 9 yards. You've already got that belief, let's suppose. Then conservatism says no need to give that up in the face of any challenge unless there's some sort of advantage. You can hang on to that belief. And that belief is epistemically justified for you in virtue of just its being the one you've got. So it's sort of innocent until proven guilty, rather than having to sort of prove the merits of the belief. And as I say here, the basic idea is that a belief gains some incremental uptick in epistemic status merely in virtue of being held, so long as no rival belief is better supported. So yeah, how are we going to apply this to the argument? Well, think about it, right? So we've got the common sense hypothesis, we've got the brain in a vat, we've got the dreams, we've got the evil genius. Those are all rival hypotheses, but none of them is better supported. The fact that they're all sort of on an equal, suppose they're all on an equal playing field. You might not think they are. Probably you think, I suspect, that the common sense hypothesis is epistemically better than any of the skeptical rivals, but that remains to be seen. Suppose that they're all on an even playing field. It would mean that none of the rivals is any better supported. And since you've already got the common sense belief, you're justified in hanging on to that one. Keep it. Don't get rid of it. It'd be like trading cars to end up with a car that's no better than the one you've got right now. There was no gain in doing so. So a couple of questions come up in connection with epistemological conservatism. How does it help defend us against skepticism, and how plausible, more importantly, how plausible is this kind of view about epistemic justification, that beliefs get some positive epistemic status just in virtue of being held? Yeah, I see what looks like a question on the horizon, or a thought.
So, just off the top of my head, what if you this is a really weird scenario, but what if you raised someone to think that their base belief was that they were in a skeptical situation going on, so they believed right off the bat, they grew up thinking that they were brain in the vat or whatever. Right. And this principle would apply there as well, because they're assuming they're all in this equal playing field. Right. They don't have any more justification to say, oh, this is all this is real. Yeah. So what about?
Thanks. So yeah, keep going with that thought though, because I think you're onto something that's a worry. So what are you thinking? What's the problem? Or maybe
in cases like that, then there's really no. You could use the epistemic conservatism thing to justify the opposite, to justify the skeptical hypothesis. You just have to change. You just have to make up some narrative.
Good. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I think that could be a great point to make in a paper on this topic, and I encourage. So thanks for bringing that out. Do people see the worry? Yeah, Anthony.
Wouldn't the fact that other people have the positive epistemic status preclude that?
The common sense hypothesis? Yeah. So one thing that he doesn't really talk about in this section, I'd have to look back at it to be sure, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't bring up the idea of rational disagreement. That comes up, I think, in Chapter 9, which is kind of a really hot topic. I'd say for the past 10, 12 years, disagreement has been a big subject that's gotten a lot of attention in contemporary epistemology. And if I'm understanding where you're headed with this, the idea is, well, these people would have to kind of, in a way, like what happens when the person who was raised to believe the matrix hypothesis or raised to believe the dream hypothesis bumps into the next door neighbor who is just like the rest of us and believes the common sense hypothesis. Isn't there going to be friction there if they start sharing, their worldviews? There'd be conflict for sure. But notice it seems like each one can say, I'm just going to stick with what I've already got. What I've got's working for me. And this dream hypothesis stuff is just fine by me because that's the way I was raised. And you can stick with the physics and chemistry and biology because that's the one that you've got. Now you may think, well, what's wrong with that? Let a million flowers bloom. Everybody gets to kind of be right, and you have your cake and eat it all. Right? Eat it too. So, yeah.
Another thing, just because this is a pretty simple response to what you have to say, that because there's all these other people who are normal and they believe that the skeptical hypotheses are false, and
Yeah.
this is all reality. Well, isn't that just kind of like an appeal to popularity, kind of? That everyone else is believing this, but
Yeah.
if they're all on the equal playing field,
Then it shouldn't have any weight how many other people accept your view.
Exactly. I don't really understand.
So, I mean, that's a response back to Anthony. Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, there's definitely grist for a short paper on this, and it might be able to be elaborated into, embedded within a larger kind of discussion of conservatism and Cartesian skepticism. So thanks. I think these are good points. So that's a worry that if someone were to have always been raised to believe in some skeptical hypothesis, they'd be able to use conservatism and this sort of conservative way of thinking about things to justify sticking with their skeptical views. So it might backfire. It kind of backfires in a way, because part of what we were hoping to do was to be able to respond to skeptical challenges. But if the most that epistemological conservatism can get us is that someone who's always had those skeptical views is entitled to them because they're all on a level playing field and because popularity isn't what's at issue, then there's a worry that maybe this isn't going to do enough. This isn't going to help. So here's an argument, a kind of response. My argument from when I made this. If conservatism's true, then necessarily lack of better support for a rival view is enough to make an existing belief justified for a person. But it seems that lack of support for a rival belief isn't enough to make an existing belief justified. So conservatism's false. Why is that? Well, because think about evidentialism, you have to have positive support for the view. It can't just be that, the way evidentialism works isn't it's innocent until proven guilty, believe whatever you want until something comes along and knocks it out. It's that there's three options. You can believe it, you can disbelieve it, or you can suspend judgment. And so the way to see how this runs into trouble, and this is, I think, a kind of corollary, a parallel point to Ian's good point, is imagine a situation where your evidence is completely counterbalanced. So you're considering some proposition, whatever it is, let it be P. And you don't have any support for thinking P is true, but you don't have any reasons for thinking not P is true. Evidentialism says do what in that situation? What should you do? According to evidentialism. You suspend, right? You withhold. But suppose that you were raised in an environment where that belief was inculcated. You're indoctrinated, brainwashed, post-hypnotic suggestion. Let your wildest exotic, scenarios rip. In a case like that, looks like epistemic conservatism is going to say, oh no, you can hang on to that belief because you don't have to have positive support for it. It just has to be that there aren't any rivals that are better supported. That doesn't seem to be the right result. It seems like it's going to violate evidentialist standards in doing that. So, yeah, I think that this probably is not going to be satisfactory. What about the next response? Let's think about that for a minute. So the next thing he thinks about, and there's an example. I didn't have us go over it, but if you want to look back at it at some point, the two suspects example on 144, it kind of brings out this same sort of point, that in a case like that where your evidence is counterbalanced either way, the fact that you've already got a belief about who the guilty party is for what it could be really erroneous reasons, that's not going to be justified for you. So the second idea as a way of, again, trying to respond to ordinary standard skepticism that he considers is this notion of immediate perceptual justification. And this is really hard stuff. Some of this we talked a little bit about in connection with modest foundationalism, if you recall that discussion. But the idea here is that the common sense hypothesis is the one that's justified rather than any of the skeptical hypotheses, because our perceptual experiences themselves provide us with immediate prima facie justification for our ordinary external world beliefs. Now, prima facie justification is defeasible justification. In other words, right now you're prima facie justified in believing that things are as they seem, but that doesn't mean that those beliefs couldn't be defeated. If suddenly someone knocked on the door and walked in and revealed that we're all part of an elaborate psychology experiment today, and unbeknownst to us, the projector is really a hologram machine, and the cup and the table are just really, really elaborate holograms. They're not the real thing. Then our evidence is at that point changed. Those ordinary beliefs are defeated, right? So here's a quote from James Pryor from a paper that came out a while back. He says, "My view is that whenever you have an experience as of P, you thereby have immediate prima facie justification for believing P. Your experiences do not in the same way give you immediate prima facie justification for believing that you're dreaming or being deceived by a demon or that any of the other skeptical hypotheses are true." And the question, of course, is why not? So he's got this principle, IPJ. Whenever a person, and there's also discussion briefly in here of Roderick Chisholm in this same section. And again, Chisholm wrote an important theory of knowledge primer. It went into 3 editions, and each edition he kind of kept modifying the view. They were 10 or 12 years apart, so there were substantial changes, but it was really influential stuff. And he sort of set out a series of epistemic principles. Feldman's got a paper on it called Chisholm's Epistemic Principles, if you wanted to look at that. And what Chisholm was really trying to do was come up with a set of conditionals whose antecedents described purely descriptive conditions, but whose consequence contained a normative or evaluative epistemological label or term. So it would be something kind of like this. Whenever a person has an experience as of P's being the case, so as of the cups being on the table, as of being in a room with other people, etc., the person has immediate prima facie justification for believing P. Notice that, again, this is just kind of a kind of cloaked conditional here, and that the antecedent just talks about your experiences being a certain way, and then whenever they're that way, whenever you satisfy that antecedent, you go on to get justified in believing something. Well, the justification language is evaluative, it's normative. So we've moved it's a bridge from the descriptive realm into the evaluative realm, which is something that's been long sought after, and it's just hard to get. These principles are tricky to formulate, and they're controversial. So a couple questions come up. One of them is, what is it exactly for a person to have an experience as of P? And the example that Feldman discusses is the 3 people in the garden. So I'll read it for us. 3 people, expert, novice, and ignorant, are standing in a garden looking, and this is over on 147, looking at a hornbeam tree. They have a clear and unobstructed view of the tree. The visual appearance present to each of the 3 people in the garden is exactly the same. Minor differences due to their slightly different positions are irrelevant in the example. Expert knows a lot about trees and can easily identify most trees, including this one, immediately. Novice knows little about trees, but's unfamiliar with hornbeams. Ignorant does not know anything about trees. He does not know which of the things in the garden is a tree and which is a flower. Clearly that person's in trouble, but we'll let that slide for now. So we've got 3 people, expert and novice and ignorant, and they're in the garden, and this is similar to the kind of Rain Man case that we talked about before in connection with modest foundationalism, where the toothpicks fall on the floor, and Tom Cruise and the waiter they have a certain visual experience, and Rain Man looks at the floor, and Rain Man has a visual experience. There's some inclination to say that they all have the same visual experience. Tom Cruise and the waiter aren't justified in believing anything about the number of toothpicks on the floor because there's just a pile of toothpicks. Rain Man instantly does the calculation based on the visual experience and comes up with a number, and it turns out to be the right number. Lightning fast, super calculator, whatever. What do we want to say about that case? Is Rain Man justified in believing that proposition about the number of toothpicks on the floor, but the other two aren't? If so, what's Rain Man got that they don't have? Are the visual experiences actually different, or are the experiences the same, but there are other factors, background knowledge, computational abilities within Rain Man's brain? So a less exotic kind of case here is this three people in a garden example. And it does raise some hard questions about exactly what it is that experience justifies. If something like immediate perceptual justification is what makes us justified in believing the common sense hypothesis and not any of these skeptical ones, then what is it about the contents of our experiences that make that so? And why is it that once you become aware of the skeptical hypotheses, that doesn't then serve as defeating information if they really are in fact rivals? So that's a potential topic that you could discuss. I think you could probably get a lot of mileage out of that. It's not easy stuff to think about, but it would be worth your time to think about whether this really works as a response to ordinary standard skepticism. All right. So the last one here for us to consider. And this takes us full circle back to Anthony's questions and Ian's questions about simplicity, theoretical simplicity. This starts over on 148. And so the idea here is to try to make out the case that the common sense hypothesis is the best explanation, and that all things considered, we should go with the best explanation of our experience, even though we can't say decisively that the skeptical hypotheses are false. They're logically possible. They don't do as good a job as our common sense and scientific explanations do. And he gives an example here of the variable colleague. This is 7.4 at the bottom of 148, to try to get you sensitive to the idea of one theory being a better explanation. So I'll read it. You work in an office and have a colleague who works with you every day. You notice that your colleague's behavior is quite variable, although not bizarre or extraordinary. Some days he's in a good mood, other days he's not. You can come up with two potential explanations of your observations. Explanation one is that your colleague's mood, and consequently his behavior, varies with how well he sleeps. This explanation can be filled out with accounts of why he sleeps better some nights than others, and explanations of how sleep affect behavior. Explanation two is that your colleague is really two different people, identical twins, with markedly different personalities. They never go out in public together and never let anyone know they're twins. They tell each other everything that happens every day, so there are no revealing episodes in which they appear to be ignorant of things they should remember from previous days. So here we've got two explanations of this colleague's behavior, and we're supposed to see right off that the variance in sleep is the better explanation than the identical twin explanation. And I think most of us have that intuition, so I'm not disagreeing with that part of it. Nevertheless, there are complicated questions, I think, about what makes for one explanation's being the best, and it's not going to all turn on simplicity. There's going to be other considerations as well. And that's something that's, again, worth thinking about. There's been a lot written, but it's still fair game. So here's the argument, the initial version of the argument. We get a revised version. Our experiential evidence is better explained by the common sense hypothesis than by any of the alternatives, the skeptical alternatives. If one explanation better explains one's evidence than any other alternative, then one's evidence better supports that explanation than any of the alternatives. So our evidence right now is better supports the common sense hypothesis than any of the skeptical alternatives. So before I go any further, what do people think about this as a response to ordinary standard skepticism? Satisfied? Does the trick? Or the standard view has been vindicated and we can breathe easy for the long weekend? I don't know. People seem kind of ho-hum about this one.
I liked it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's tempting to go this route. I don't. And there's a quote that I'll read that's useful. Peter Railton has this quote at the bottom of, or Peter Lipton at the bottom of 149. As part of the answer to the Cartesian skeptic who asks how we can know that the world is not just a dream, or that we're not just brains and vats, the realist, the person who buys into the common sense hypothesis, may argue that we're entitled to believe in the external world since hypotheses that presuppose it provide the best explanation of our experiences. It is possible that it's all a dream or that we're really brains and vats, but these are less good explanations, of the course of our experience than the ones we all believe. So we're rationally entitled to our belief in the external world. Again, I mean, I try to strike a balance between just patting ourselves on the back and congratulating, the standard view, but at the same time, I want to take skepticism seriously and take the challenge at face value. I think this is tempting. One question that comes up and that Feldman discusses is whether or not it's enough for one hypothesis to simply be the best explanation, one theory to be the best explanation, or is it something more subtle, like the person having to know that that's the best explanation? So a revised version of this initial argument would say something. See, this just talks about what the best explanation is, whether we're aware of it or not. The revised version of the argument builds into it that the person is in fact aware that this is the best explanation. One of the worries here, of course, is that most, folks aren't taking epistemology classes, and they're not worrying about the dream hypothesis or evil demons or brains and vats. In fact, they're probably not spending much time at all thinking about the best explanation of their overall experience. They're just having experiences. So if part of the project and part of what the standard view entails or encompasses is that there are lots of other folks out there that aren't philosophers who know quite a bit as well, then whatever account we give of that knowledge needs to build that into it and take that into consideration. So it might be that something like the revision is acceptable or is preferable. At the bottom, this is before the conclusion at 151, he says there's a dilemma then for defenders of the best explanation response. The first premise of the original version seems more plausible than the first premise in the revision, since it includes ordinary people who haven't thought about skepticism. But the second premise of the revision is considerably more plausible than the second premise of the original version. The best option for defenders of the best explanation view is to claim that the revised version is true and that typical people who've not thought about these matters are nevertheless justified in believing in the common sense hypothesis. I wonder. So you can think about that and see whether you agree with Feldman on that point or not. All right, so thoughts, questions, comments about ordinary standard skepticism. The only remaining thing then is this contextualism, this appendix that starts over on 152. That became a kind of hot topic just as he was finishing up the manuscript for this, so that's why he includes it as an appendix. And I'll say a little bit about that. There's a famous paper by David Lewis and by Stuart Cohen, both, and also by Keith DeRose, more recently, trying to defend versions of contextualism, the idea that the word knows is semantically context sensitive and that its meaning shifts depending on the context you're in. So in everyday life, when we're not thinking about Cartesian skepticism and people say they know where their car is parked, they typically do. They're right, because we're not bringing in skeptical considerations. Those are sort of bracketed. But when you're in this classroom doing what we've been doing, all of a sudden the fact that you might be a brain in a vat or the victim of an evil demon or dreaming all of this, those hypotheses have been made salient. They're fair game. They're no longer bracketed. And so the idea behind contextualism is to find some way of being able to kind of, again, have your cake and eat it too, to say, well, in everyday life, under ordinary circumstances, people are right when they claim to know, but only after thinking about this stuff the way we've been doing it does that knowledge get undermined. Hence the title of Lewis's paper, Elusive Knowledge. So I'll say some more about contextualism next time. Clearly, some words are context sensitive, semantically context sensitive. What counts as tall depends on a reference class. So are we talking about 5-year-olds or NBA basketball players? It seems like that kind of varies. Whether or not knowledge is like that is a matter of considerable controversy. And I'll go ahead and say, I know Feldman doesn't think that it's context sensitive. He's against that view. So anyway, have a great weekend. I'll see y'all next time. Go ahead and take a look at the new discussion board and read Chapter 8. Thanks.